The fluorescent lights in the County General Hospital emergency room were shining with the same harsh brightness as they had for the past 12 hours. Ruth Avery was sitting in the nurse's station. 35-year-old Ruth behaved like someone who had seen the worst of humanity and yet chose to be compassionate. Her dark skin glowed under the hospital's harsh lights. She wore a standard nurse's uniform. "Nurse Avery, trauma case incoming," called the head nurse. "He'll be here in 2 minutes. Male, mid-20s, reported assaulted." Ruth had already begun her preparations. Ruth grabbed her trauma bag and headed for Bay 3. She had 20 years of experience as an emergency nurse, having spent 10 years with the Army Reserves in war zones before moving to civilian healthcare. She was experienced in all kinds of situations. The ambulance compartment doors opened at exactly 12:14. The young black man on the stretcher was conscious but clearly in pain, his face swollen and bruised, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle. Jamal Richardson, 26 years old, the chief paramedic reported as he transferred him to the hospital stretcher. Multiple contusions, possible arm and rib fractures. The patient reports being beaten during a traffic stop about 90 minutes ago. This was a very bad situation. Ruth's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs, assessing injuries, and establishing an IV line. But Ruth knew this was no simple traffic altercation. "Mr. Richardson, I'm Ruth. I'm going to take care of you," she said gently. "Can you tell me what happened?" She was trying to understand what had transpired. Jamal's voice, probably from shouting, was rough. "Traffic control. I asked why I was being stopped. Officer Callaway suddenly started hitting me. He said I resisted. I didn't resist. I swear I didn't resist," Jamal said excitedly. Ruth understood something. It was a feeling she knew all too well. Ruth's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but her hands remained steady as she documented the injuries. The name Callaway triggered a memory. She had treated 3 other patients in the last 6 months with similar stories, similar injuries, and similar looks of terror in their eyes. "Dr. Martinez," Ruth called to the doctor on duty. "Trauma consultation, please." Dr. Caroline Martinez arrived and quickly assessed the patient's condition with her experienced eyes. "Mr. Richardson, we need to document these injuries," Ruth explained. "With your permission, I'd like to take photographs for your medical record and inform you about filing a complaint," she said. Her goal was to inform Jamal. "What's the point?" he said. There was bitter resignation in Jamal's voice. "I filed a complaint last time. Nothing happened. They always protect their own," he said. Ruth gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "That may have been the case last time, but documentation is important," she said. He didn't know that those words would come back to haunt him less than an hour later, because his commitment to documentation would make him a target. The treatment continued until the afternoon. Ruth worked with her usual meticulousness and gave Jamal the contact information for legal aid and victim support services. Ruth had only one goal: to help Jamal. At 1:47 p.m., as Ruth was completing Jamal's discharge papers, the emergency room's automatic doors opened. 4 police officers entered the emergency room with such aggressive determination that staff and patients instinctively stepped back. Leading them was Officer Derek Callaway, in his mid-30s. Ruth recognized him immediately from Jamal's description. She gripped the clipboard tightly in her hand, but her face remained professionally neutral. She knew what could happen to her if she got too involved. "Nurse Avery," said Callaway, "we need to talk to you about a patient." Everyone in the emergency room watched what was happening intently. Ruth deliberately placed the clipboard on the table with a calm demeanor. "Officer, patient information is protected by HIPAA. If you have questions about a specific case, you must go through the proper channels and provide the necessary documentation," she warned. Callaway's face flushed. "We don't need documentation. We need answers about Jamal Richardson. Right now," he ordered. "Then you need to make a formal request to the hospital's legal department," Ruth replied. "I can give you their contact information," she said. The 3 officers who had come with Callaway shifted uncomfortably. They were younger and more indecisive, and the hospital's bright environment clearly unsettled them, given their superior's aggressive approach. "I'm not asking," Callaway said, stepping into Ruth's professional space. "I'm telling you, the patient you just treated made a false complaint about me, and you helped him." Ruth's expression didn't change, but something became apparent in her eyes. "Officer Callaway, I documented injuries consistent with the patient's statement and my professional medical assessment. If you have concerns about my medical judgment, you can file a complaint with the nursing board," she said. Ruth consistently answered within the confines of the law. "You're interfering with a police investigation," Callaway said, his hand moving toward his belt. Dr. Martinez appeared over Ruth's shoulder. "Officer, you are obstructing patient care in a medical facility. If you have official business, show proper documentation. Otherwise, I will have to ask you to leave," he said. Callaway's eyes darted between the 2 women, calculating. The emergency room had fallen silent. Others in the emergency room were taking notes. "Ruth Avery," Callaway said. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence in an ongoing investigation." This was an outright lie. "This is nonsense," Dr. Martinez began. "I want to see the arrest warrant," Ruth said. "No warrant is needed for obstruction," Callaway said, pulling out the handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he ordered. Ruth looked at Dr. Martinez. "Please call the hospital's legal team and inform my brother, Marcus Avery. His number is in my emergency contacts," she said. Ruth wasn't afraid at all. She was very calm because she knew she was right. Her confidence was perfectly in place. She slowly turned and deliberately complied, clasping her hands behind her back. Callaway grabbed her wrists roughly and pulled them up too high. The metal cuffs closed with excessive force, digging into her skin. Ruth grimaced but didn't make a sound. "Officer, the cuffs are too tight," Dr. Martinez protested. "You're cutting off her circulation," he warned Callaway. "She'll survive," Callaway muttered. Then, speaking louder to the watching crowd, he said, "Maybe this will teach other hospital staff not to lie about criminals." His aim was to provide material for the videographers recording the scene. He believed this would justify his actions. He pushed Ruth forward, causing her to stumble. The young officers moved to steady her, looking increasingly uncomfortable with their superior's behavior. They made their way toward the exit. The automatic doors opened. The parking lot was as busy as ever. A news van was pulling into the parking lot. Ruth saw a woman with a camera get out and start filming. Callaway saw this too. He gripped Ruth's arm painfully tightly. "Keep going," he ordered. They had reached the middle of the parking lot and were heading toward the waiting police van when a voice rang out. "Ruth!" Marcus Avery came running out of the main hospital entrance. Despite being 40 years old, he still carried the precision of 20 years of special operations experience. He had come to meet Ruth for their weekly lunch, a tradition they had continued since retiring. "Marcus, back off," Ruth shouted. "This is an unjust arrest, but don't give them an excuse," she warned her brother. Marcus stopped 20 meters away, his hands visible and open. "Officers, I'm Marcus Avery, Ruth's brother. What are the charges?" he asked. He was trying to understand what was happening. "Obstruction of justice," Callaway replied. "Interfering with a police investigation," he said. "That's nonsense. She's a trauma nurse. She documented the injuries as standard medical protocol," said Marcus. "I want to see the arrest warrant," he added. "No need to obstruct justice," said Callaway. Marcus took out his phone, his movements slow and deliberate. "I am recording this conversation for legal purposes. Ruth, do not answer any questions unless your lawyer is present," he warned his sister. "Turn that off," Callaway shouted. "I have the right to record police activity in a public place," Marcus replied. A reporter with a camera had approached and was now clearly filming. Callaway's face turned dark red. Public attention was clearly not part of his plan. "You're interfering with police business," he said, trying to intimidate people away. But it was futile. He didn't even realize what he was getting himself into. He was making the biggest mistake of his life. "I'm 6 meters away from you and my sister. My hands are visible, and I'm not making any moves toward you," Marcus replied. "I'm just observing and recording a public arrest. If this is interference, then everyone here with a phone is a criminal," he said. Marcus was right when he spoke. Ruth watched this argument with pride, despite her situation. Marcus was doing exactly what she wanted, but Callaway's anger was visibly growing. He grabbed Ruth's arm again and pulled her toward the police van with unnecessary force. "Let's go," he ordered. At that moment, Dr. Martinez's voice echoed authoritatively from the hospital entrance. "Officer Callaway, Nurse Avery is currently on duty at a healthcare facility. Removing her from here without proper cause constitutes interference with emergency medical services, which is a federal offense," he said. Callaway turned around, his hand instinctively reaching for his stun gun. "Back off," he said. "I'm standing my ground and reminding you of the law," said Dr. Martinez. "You have no search warrant. You haven't provided reasonable cause, and you are removing a key healthcare worker from an emergency department on duty," he warned Callaway. The young officers whispered to each other, clearly acknowledging that this was beyond them. Marcus's phone was still recording. Callaway made his decision. He drew the stun gun from his belt. "Ruth Avery, you're under arrest. Stop resisting," he said. Ruth didn't even flinch. "I'm not resisting," Ruth said. "My hands are cuffed. I'm completely compliant," she continued. "You're being aggressive and uncooperative," Callaway said. Then he pressed the stun gun against Ruth's side and pulled the trigger. It was pure brutality. The electric current struck like lightning. Ruth's body trembled uncontrollably. Her legs weakened. Unable to control her muscles, Ruth collapsed onto the asphalt, the handcuffs unable to prevent her fall. She heard Marcus yell. She heard Dr. Martinez scream for security. She heard Callaway radio, "Suspect down, resisting arrest." The last thing Ruth noticed before losing consciousness was the irony. Then the world went dark, and Ruth Avery became another victim of the violence she had spent her career trying to fix. Ruth regained consciousness to the familiar sounds and smells of the emergency room. It was the same emergency room she had worked in for the past 8 years, but now she was on the wrong side of the stretcher. The fluorescent lights hurt her eyes. Her head throbbed with nauseating intensity, and every muscle in her body ached from the electric shock weapon's attack. "Ruth, can you hear me?" said Dr. Martinez. "You're in room 5. You hit your head on the sidewalk and suffered a concussion." Ruth tried to speak, but her mouth felt thick and clumsy. The words wouldn't come out right. She stuttered a lot. She managed to call out, "Marcus." "I'm here, sis," said Marcus. His voice came from the other side. "Don't try to talk. You're safe now. Callaway is dead, and there are about 50 witnesses who recorded what he did," he said. The memories came back. The stun gun, the fall, the asphalt hitting her face. Ruth's hand instinctively went to her head and found a bandage covering the left side of her forehead. "3 staples," said Dr. Martinez. "You're lucky it wasn't worse. The electroshock caused muscle spasms and prevented you from catching yourself as you fell." "Did someone?" she tried to say. Ruth's voice was hoarse but clearer now. "Did someone record this?" she asked. Marcus lifted his phone. "Everyone did. I recorded the whole thing from 20 meters away," he said. He opened social media on his phone and showed Ruth the video, which had been viewed over 100,000 times in the last 2 hours. The images were very heavy. The comments section was filled with rage. "The hospital CEO is demanding a federal investigation," Dr. Martinez continued. "The nurses union is filing a formal complaint, and about 30 of your colleagues gave statements to the FBI agents who arrived 40 minutes ago." The incident had escalated so quickly that everyone had seen the video. As if her name had been called, a woman in a dark suit appeared at the entrance to Ward 5. In her early 40s, fair-skinned, she had the professional demeanor of federal law enforcement. "Miss Avery, I'm FBI Civil Rights Division Special Agent Andrea Cooper. I need to take your statement regarding this afternoon's events," she said. Ruth tried to sit up. Marcus gently laid her back down. "Agent Cooper, my sister has a concussion. Can we wait until she's medically cleared?" he asked. "Unfortunately, no. Evidence deteriorates over time, and I need her memories while they're fresh," she said, pulling out a recording device. "Miss Avery, with your permission, I'm going to record this. You are not under investigation. You are a victim and a witness. Everything you tell me will be used in the federal civil rights case we're bringing against Officer Callaway and possibly others," she said. Ruth slowly nodded. "Ask your questions," she said. For the next 30 minutes, Cooper asked Ruth about every detail. "Did Officer Callaway give you any instructions before using the stun gun?" Cooper asked. "He said I was resisting, but I was handcuffed. I wasn't moving. I was cooperating with everything," she said. Cooper took notes. "And this wasn't the first time you've treated a patient who claimed Officer Callaway used excessive force, was it?" he asked. The case was going to get bigger. Ruth would have to recount past incidents as well. "No. In the last 6 months I treated 3 other patients with similar injuries and similar stories," Ruth said. "They all specifically mentioned Officer Callaway," she added to her statement. "Did you report this to anyone?" Cooper asked. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. "I reported it to the hospital administration. They said they would forward the information to the relevant authorities. I never heard back," she replied. Cooper's tone hardened. "We're going to investigate why those reports disappeared. In the meantime, I want you to give me all the documents you have related to these cases," he said. Marcus spoke up. "Agent Cooper, my sister was arrested without a warrant, assaulted while handcuffed, and suffered traumatic brain injury. What will happen to Officer Callaway?" Marcus wondered. He thought there should be consequences. "He's been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. But I'll be honest with you. When police officers use excessive force, they rarely face consequences, even with video evidence. That's why I'm here from the Civil Rights Division. This case shows a trend of targeting healthcare workers who document police violence. This isn't just assault, it's a violation of civil rights, intimidation of witnesses, and obstruction of justice," he said. He turned to Ruth. "Miss Avery, you need to understand something. By giving this statement, by agreeing to pursue this case, you are making yourself a target. Officer Callaway has friends in the department. The union will protect him. The prosecution may decline to pursue charges. Are you prepared for this fight?" he asked. Despite the throbbing in her head, Ruth looked Cooper straight in the eye with determination. "Agent Cooper, I've been a trauma nurse for 15 years. I served in war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. I treated soldiers and civilians under fire. I held dying patients in my arms and told their families there was nothing more we could do. I chose this profession because healing is more important than staying safe." Her voice grew stronger. "Officer Callaway targeted me because I documented his violence. If I don't stand up to him, he'll keep doing it. Other healthcare workers will be intimidated into silence. Patients will continue to be beaten, and there will be no evidence to support their claims. Yes, I'm ready for this fight." Cooper smiled slightly. "Good. because I'm going to turn this investigation into a full-scale federal investigation, and I'm going to need you to be strong. Over the next 3 hours, as Ruth's concussion symptoms were monitored, the extent of what had happened began to emerge. Tasha Ingwan arrived with a camera crew after preparing a segment on the arrest for the local news. She sat down beside Ruth's bed, striking a balance between journalistic instinct and genuine compassion. "Miss Avery, I'm Tasha. I filmed what happened in the parking lot. I've been investigating Officer Callaway for 6 months, and your case connects to a pattern I've documented." She opened files on her laptop. Last year, 7 healthcare workers in this city were arrested, threatened, or harassed after treating patients who had filed complaints with the police. All 7 were documented as having been injured by excessive force. All 7 faced retaliation. Ruth looked at the screen and saw photos of doctors, nurses, and emergency medical technicians. Different faces, united by their commitment to proper medical documentation. "What happened to them?" Ruth asked. 2 were cleared of charges after lengthy legal battles. 3 are still fighting. 1 lost her nursing license on fabricated grounds. Another left the state entirely because the harassment became unbearable. Tasha's face was grim. "The pattern is clear. Police are systematically targeting medical professionals who present evidence of their violence." Marcus was making phone calls in the hallway and returned with news. "I just spoke with attorney James Whitfield from the Civil Rights Law Alliance. He'll take your case pro bono and file a federal lawsuit against Callaway, the police department, and the city for civil rights violations, assault, and conspiracy." He sat down on the edge of Ruth's bed, his Navy SEAL composure cracking slightly as he showed brotherly concern. "Ruth, they're going to try to destroy your reputation. They'll dig into your past and look for anything they can use to undermine you. Are you sure you want to do this?" Ruth reached out her hand. "Marcus, when I was 16, you taught me close combat training so I could defend myself. You taught me that the most important battles aren't the ones you can win with strength, but the ones where you refuse to back down even if your opponent is superior. This is one of those battles." Deacon Lewis Brown arrived as evening approached, bringing with him 3 other community leaders. The elderly black minister had been a civil rights activist for 50 years and recognized the significance of what was happening. "Sister Ruth," he said, gently taking her empty hand, "the community is coming together. Your church, the hospital staff, the patients you've treated over the years. Everyone wants to support you. Tomorrow evening, we will hold a prayer vigil and community organizing meeting at my church. Will you be well enough to attend?" Ruth looked at Dr. Martinez, who was silently monitoring her vital signs. The doctor nodded. "Medically, you can be discharged in a few hours as long as your scans remain stable. But you need rest. Avoid strenuous activity for at least a week. Then I'll be there," Ruth said. "This isn't just about me. It's about every healthcare worker silenced, every patient whose wounds are ignored, every family who loses someone to violence and lacks the evidence to seek justice." At 8 p.m., the spring sun finally set, and as the hospital switched to the evening shift, Ruth's room had turned into an impromptu war room. Attorney Whitfield had arrived with 2 colleagues and spread legal documents across every available surface. Agent Cooper returned with 3 other FBI inspectors and took additional statements from hospital staff who had witnessed the arrest. Tasha had set up a small editing station in the corner and was turning footage from different angles into a comprehensive documentary segment. Marcus coordinated with his old military contacts. Many of these individuals were experienced in police accountability issues and offered tactical advice on how to conduct the investigation. Dr. Martinez brought dinner. Ruth normally preferred not to eat in the hospital cafeteria, but tonight the meal had a taste of solidarity. "The nurses' union representative will be here tomorrow morning. We will file a formal complaint and demand policy changes to protect healthcare workers from police retaliation." Ruth's phone had been returned to her and was ringing non-stop. Messages from colleagues, patients she had treated, people she hadn't heard from in years, all expressing their support, sharing their own stories of police violence, offering whatever help they could. A message from an unknown number caught her attention. "Thank you for documenting what happened to me. Because of you, I have proof. Because of you, I'm not crazy. Because of you, people believe me. Jamal Richardson." Ruth showed this to Marcus, and despite her mind being foggy from the painkillers, her eyes filled with tears. "He's the patient who came in this afternoon. He's the one who started all this with the attack." "He didn't start it," Marcus gently corrected. "Callaway started it by beating people and covering it up. You just had the courage to document the truth. There's a difference." Attorney Whitfield looked up from his legal research. "Miss Avery, I want you to understand the situation we're facing. Officer Callaway is represented by the police union, which has nearly unlimited resources. The prosecution usually refuses to pursue cases against police officers. The judges are often former prosecutors who are friendly toward law enforcement, and the department closes ranks to protect him." He spread out documents showing previous cases, officers with extensive complaint histories but no consequences, victims who won civil lawsuits but never faced criminal prosecution, patterns of obstruction and cover-up. But, Whitfield continued, we have something we don't have in other cases. We have a trauma nurse with an impeccable reputation in military service like yours. We have your brother, a decorated Navy SEAL who can assess the tactical use of excessive force. There are videos taken from different angles showing an open attack on a compliant handcuffed victim. And most importantly, there is evidence of a systematic pattern targeting healthcare workers who document police violence. He pulled out a legal strategy document. The FBI is conducting an investigation under federal civil rights laws. I'm also filing a lawsuit. The nurses' union is filing a complaint of professional standards violations. The hospital is demanding accountability. Tasha's documentary will keep public pressure constant. We're attacking on all fronts simultaneously. Agent Cooper added, I have approval to expand the investigation beyond Callaway. We are looking at everyone who knew about the system targeting his entire unit, the chain of command, the medical experts, and did nothing to stop it. Dr. Martinez's phone rang. He stepped away to answer, then returned with a sullen expression. Hospital administration was calling. Officer Callaway's lawyer is demanding we hand over all personnel files, claiming Ruth has a police bias and that her documents are forged. He claims she has a history of police bias and asserts he has proven her documents are fake. This is like phishing, Whitfield said immediately. They have no evidence, so they're trying to make up a story. We'll object to the record request and file for a protective order. Ruth's head was throbbing again, the pain outlasting the effects of the medication. Marcus noticed this immediately. Everyone out. My sister needs to rest. Dr. Martinez checked Ruth's vital signs once more and made sure her concussion hadn't worsened. You can be discharged, but you need to rest at home. Don't work for at least a week. If your headaches, vision problems, or mental fog worsen, come back immediately. As the room slowly emptied, Marcus helped Ruth into a wheelchair. Though Ruth protested that she could walk, this was the hospital's discharge policy. Tasha accompanied them to the parking lot and continued filming. She captured the irony of Ruth, who had worked in the same emergency room for years, being wheeled out in a wheelchair as a victim of the violence she had documented throughout her career. It was a warm spring evening, the parking lot lit by street lamps, casting long shadows. This was the spot where Ruth had been electrocuted and fallen 8 hours earlier. The blood stain had been cleaned up, but Ruth could still see it in her mind. Marcus's truck was parked nearby. As he helped Ruth into the passenger seat, careful of her bandaged head, Agent Cooper approached. Ms. Avery, there's one more thing. The FBI will be watching your house tonight with agents. Officer Callaway is on administrative leave, but that doesn't mean he won't do anything. We've seen cases where officers' friends use intimidation tactics against witnesses. I can protect my sister, Marcus said quietly, the controlled threat in his voice clearly the result of his Navy SEAL training. I have no doubt, Cooper replied. But let's do this legally. FBI protection means any harassment or threats will be officially documented. That strengthens the civil rights case. Ruth sat down in the truck seat, exhaustion washing over her. Thank you, Agent Cooper, for taking this seriously, for not dismissing this as just another complaint against the police. Miss Papling, I've been investigating civil rights violations for 15 years. I've seen too many cases where victims are intimidated into silence, evidence disappears, and justice is obstructed because the powerful protect their own. Your case, your willingness to fight despite the risks could change that. I will make that happen. Marcus insisted that Ruth stay with him rather than be alone for a few days as he headed home in the evening. Ruth looked out the window at the city she had served for years. She thought of Jamal Richardson, beaten during a traffic stop. She thought about the other 3 patients she had treated with similar stories. She thought about Tasha identifying the 7 healthcare workers who were retaliated against for speaking the truth. She thought of all the victims who never reported, never documented, never resisted, because they believed they were hopeless. Her head throbbed. Her body ached. The taste of asphalt and fear still lingered on her tongue. But beneath the pain, something else was growing. A resolve forged in war zones and emergency rooms, strengthened by choosing to heal rather than harm. By documenting the truth even when it was uncomfortable, Officer Callaway had wanted to intimidate and silence her. Instead, he had given her a platform, evidence, and a federal investigation. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Legal proceedings, media coverage, community organizing, the slow and arduous process of holding systems designed to evade accountability to account. But tonight, Ruth Avery rested knowing she had done what she always did, documented the truth, helped, and refused to let violence go unpunished. The stun gun knocked her to the ground, but it hadn't silenced her. And this, as Officer Callaway was about to learn, would be his fatal mistake. The morning sun streamed through the high windows of Marcus's guest room, casting geometric patterns on the parquet floor. Ruth woke slowly, her head still throbbing, but yesterday's sharp pain had become a bearable ache. She gently touched the bandage on her forehead, grimacing at the sensitive staples beneath. Her phone showed 107 unread messages, 34 missed calls, and notifications from news apps that her bruised and bloodied face from yesterday's attack was on the front pages of every newspaper in the region. The headline that kept appearing was, "Electroshock applied to handcuffed nurse, FBI investigating police attack." Marcus appeared at the door with coffee and toast. "How's your head?" "It hurts, but I've been through worse." Ruth gratefully accepted the coffee. "What time is the community meeting?" "At 6 p.m. at Deacon Brown's church. But you don't have to go if you're not ready." "I'll go." Ruth's voice carried the certainty of someone who had made up her mind and wouldn't change it. "People need to see that I'm not backing down, that this kind of retaliation doesn't work." By noon, Ruth was dressed and poring over the legal documents Attorney Whitfield had sent the night before. The federal civil rights suit ran 47 pages and meticulously documented not only yesterday's assault but also patterns of behavior targeting healthcare workers that documented police brutality. At exactly 1 p.m., the doorbell rang. Agent Cooper stood on the porch with 2 FBI inspectors and a woman Ruth didn't recognize. The woman was dressed professionally in her late 50s and possessed the kind of authority typical of a high-ranking law enforcement official. "Ms. Avery, this is Deputy Director Patricia Morrison from the FBI Civil Rights Division," Cooper introduced. She came from headquarters to personally oversee this investigation. Morrison's handshake was firm but mindful of Ruth's injuries. "Ms. Avery, your case has led to a comprehensive examination of interactions between police and healthcare workers in this judicial district. What we've uncovered is disturbing." They moved into Marcus's living room, and Morrison spread the documents on the coffee table. The afternoon sunlight illuminated pages of evidence, reports, medical records, witness statements. "Over the past 18 months, Morrison began, we identified 17 incidents in which healthcare workers in this city were arrested, threatened, or harassed after treating patients who had filed complaints against the police. Officer Callaway was directly involved in 7 of those incidents. In the other 10, officers from his unit or with close ties to him were involved." He produced an organizational chart showing the connections between officers, supervisors, and department management. "This isn't isolated abuse. It's a systematic campaign to intimidate and silence medical professionals." Ruth studied the chart. Her nursing training helped her spot the patterns. They're targeting anyone who proves excessive force. Doctors who document injuries, nurses who photograph injuries, emergency medical technicians who report suspicious circumstances. We're all potential witnesses against them. "Exactly." Morrison highlighted specific cases. Emergency room doctor Dr. James Chen was arrested on charges of interfering with police work after documenting a patient's ribs broken by a baton strike. Nurse Patricia Williams was threatened with a child services investigation after treating a young man beaten during a stop and search. Paramedic David Santos was fired on trumped-up grounds after reporting that a suicide victim had defensive wounds consistent with an assault, Cooper added. And in every case, complaints were filed, internal investigations were opened and dismissed. This pattern emerges when you look at the cases as a whole, which is exactly what the department wanted, for individual victims to feel alone and not realize this is systematic. Ruth felt her anger turn to resolve. "What can we do about this?" Morrison's face hardened with determination. "We're filing federal charges under Title 18, Section 242, deprivation of rights under the law. We're investigating the entire chain of command to identify those who knew about this pattern and did nothing. And we're using your case as a catalyst to expose a conspiracy that's been going on for years." Detailed discussions continued into the afternoon. Ruth described not only yesterday's attack, but also 3 patients she had treated previously who mentioned the Callaway officer. She presented her own detailed nursing notes, which documented medical records, photographs, and injuries with professional meticulousness. "The documentation is extraordinary," Morrison said, examining Ruth's meticulous records. "Detailed descriptions, measurements, photographic evidence, patient statements. This is exactly the kind of evidence that secures convictions in federal court." "I was trained in war zones," Ruth replied. "Documentation is crucial when treating wounds under fire. It can distinguish between proper care and medical malpractice. I brought that same standard to civilian practice." At 4 p.m. Tasha Engwin arrived with her camera crew. She had obtained permission to film the FBI interview for her documentary and positioned the cameras to capture Ruth's resolute testimony. "This footage will air tonight," Tasha explained, along with interviews from other healthcare workers facing retaliation. "We titled this segment The Conspiracy of Silence, When Police Target Medical Experts." She showed Ruth the rough cuts, doctors describing arrests, nurses explaining threats, emergency medical technicians detailing harassment. Each story mirrored Ruth's experience and formed an undeniable pattern. "People need to see this," Tasha said quietly. "People trust healthcare workers. When they see the police systematically attacking doctors and nurses who speak the truth, the narrative changes." At 5:30 p.m., Ruth and Marcus went to New Hope Baptist Church, where Deacon Brown was holding a community meeting. It was a warm spring evening, and the afternoon sun cast long golden rays across the church's brick facade. The parking lot was already full, with extra cars parked all the way down the block. Ruth could see the news vans of 3 television stations, the cameras set up, and the reporters preparing for the live broadcast. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked as he helped Ruth out of the truck. His protective instinct was evident in how carefully he watched her movements. "I don't think I have a choice," Ruth replied. "But yes, I'm ready." The church was packed. Every pew was full, people were standing along the walls, and the balcony was filled with community members who had come to support Ruth and demand accountability. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows, bathing the congregation in jewel tones. Ruth recognized some faces, colleagues from the hospital, patients she had treated over the years, neighbors, members of the church choir, but there were also strangers who had come to watch and witness. Deacon Brown greeted them at the entrance, his worn face showing both concern and determination. "Sister Ruth, God has given you a platform. The question is, how will you use it?" Ruth touched the bandage on her forehead. "The same way I use my nursing license, to heal the broken and prevent further harm." The meeting began at 6 p.m. Deacon Brown opened the meeting with a prayer, his voice echoing through the crowded church. "God, we gather in the light of truth, refusing to let violence hide in darkness. We ask for strength for the injured, wisdom for those seeking justice, and courage for those who speak truth to power." Attorney Whitfield explained the legal strategy in terms the congregation could understand. "We are fighting this battle on many fronts: a federal civil rights case, an FBI criminal investigation, complaints from the nursing union, hospital policy reforms, and most importantly, public pressure to ensure this case doesn't get lost in the system." He introduced the other 7 healthcare workers who had become targets of retaliation. One by one, they took the podium and told their stories. Emergency physician Dr. James Chen recounted being handcuffed in front of his colleagues after documenting a patient's injuries sustained from a police baton. "They wanted to humiliate me, to make other doctors think twice before making honest medical assessments." Nurse Patricia Williams, struggling to hold back tears, recounted how she was called in to have her parenting skills investigated by Child Services after reporting a teenager's suspicious injuries. "They used my children as weapons against me. They were that desperate to silence the medical experts." Paramedic David Santos detailed how he lost his job over fabricated accusations. "I documented evidence that contradicted the police's suicide story. Despite 15 years of excellent evaluations, I was fired within a week for performance issues." Each story complemented the previous one, painting a picture of systematic intimidation. The congregation reacted with shock, tears, and mounting anger at the scale of the conspiracy. Then Ruth took the podium. The church fell silent except for the sound of camera shutters. Everyone's eyes were on the bandaged nurse who had become a symbol of resistance against police retaliation. "My name is Ruth Avery," she began, her voice steady despite the throbbing pain in her head. "I am a trauma nurse with 15 years of experience, including combat assignments in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yesterday I was attacked not in a war zone but in the parking lot of the hospital where I work. I was handcuffed, electrocuted, and suffered traumatic brain injury." She described her confrontation with Officer Callaway, the arrest without a warrant, and the excessive force used despite her complete compliance. "I was targeted for doing my job, for documenting the injuries of patients who reported police violence, for telling the truth in my medical records." Ruth's hands gripped the podium tightly. "But I'm not the first, and if we don't demand change, I won't be the last. The people you've heard from tonight, doctors, nurses, paramedics, we've all been targeted for the same reason. We provide evidence. We document the truth. They can't intimidate us into altering our medical assessments to protect officers who abuse their power." She pulled out her phone and showed a message from Jamal Richardson. "This came from a patient I treated yesterday, just hours before he was attacked. He thanked me for documenting what happened to him. He said my records prove people believed him. He's not crazy. He has proof." Her voice grew stronger. "That's why this matters. Not just for me, but for every patient who's been beaten and told no one will believe them. For every family who's lost someone to violence and had the evidence covered up. For every community that's learned to stay silent because speaking out means revenge." Ruth looked out at the packed church. "Officer Callaway thought he could send me a message by electroshocking me, that healthcare workers should be afraid to speak the truth. But I'm sending him this message: we won't be silent. We will document the violence. We will present evidence. And no matter how powerful those who try to stop us are, we will demand accountability." The congregation responded with a thunderous applause that shook the beams of the old church. People stood up, some crying, some shouting in approval. The congregation's anger and hope became something too powerful to ignore, a collective demand for justice. Agent Cooper stepped to the podium. "The FBI is conducting a comprehensive investigation into civil rights violations by the police department. We are looking not only at individual officers, but also at the systematic pattern targeting witnesses and medical professionals. If you have any information about police abuse or retaliation, we have set up a confidential tip line." He gave the number, and Ruth watched as dozens of people took out their phones to take note. Tasha Engwin showed excerpts from her documentary, including footage of the moment Ruth was attacked from different angles. The crowd watching the footage on the big screen reacted with horror to this brutality: the use of a stun gun on a handcuffed woman, the fall, the sickening sound of Ruth's head hitting the pavement. "These images have been viewed over 2 million times in 24 hours, said Tasha. National news is also covering this story. Civil rights organizations are calling for federal intervention. This incident is now too big to be swept under the rug." When the official presentations ended, Deacon Brown promised to listen to the community's testimonies. A line formed in front of the microphone. People were eager to share their own stories of police violence, denied medical evidence, and complaints lost in bureaucratic black holes. An elderly woman recounted how her granddaughter's injuries sustained during a traffic stop were photographed by an emergency room nurse who was later fired. A father recounted the accident his daughter suffered during her arrest. This accident caused permanent nerve damage to his daughter and was documented by a doctor whose license was under review. A veteran recounted being electrocuted during a mental health crisis and being saved by emergency medical technicians who defended his care despite police pressure to arrest him. Story after story, this pattern became undeniable, and in each testimony there was gratitude for the healthcare workers who provided evidence and spoke the truth despite the risks. The meeting went past 8 p.m. The interior lights of the church now complementing the evening sun filtering through the stained glass windows. No one left. The energy in the sacred space shifted from anger to organization. People were sharing phone numbers, forming committees, planning next steps. Attorney Whitfield announced a class action lawsuit on behalf of all healthcare workers facing retaliation. Agent Morrison announced that the FBI investigation had been expanded to include the police chief and district attorney for possible conspiracy charges. Deacon Brown held weekly accountability meetings to keep up the pressure. When the meeting finally ended after 9 p.m., Ruth found herself surrounded by well-wishers, supportive nurse friends, and patients thanking her for years of compassionate care. Marcus stayed by her side to monitor whether Ruth's concussion symptoms worsened, but Ruth drew strength from the community's energy. Outside, under the parking lot lights, news reporters waited for statements. Ruth stood on the church steps, next to Marcus, and looked into the cameras that would broadcast her words to the region. "Officer Callaway attacked me because he thought he could intimidate and silence medical professionals," Ruth said, the bandage on her forehead visible in the camera lights. "But he forgot one important thing. Healthcare workers don't run from danger, they run toward it. We don't abandon patients because their treatment is risky, and we don't stop documenting the truth because telling it will lead to retaliation." A reporter asked, "What do you want to happen to Officer Callaway?" "I want him to receive the harshest punishment allowed under federal law. I want every officer who knew about this situation and did nothing to be held accountable. I want systematic reforms that protect healthcare workers and the patients we serve. And I want every victim of police violence to know that their medical records matter, that documentation creates evidence, that the truth has power." Another reporter, "Are you afraid of more retaliation?" Ruth looked directly into the camera. "I am a trauma nurse who has served in war zones. Fear is part of the job, but so is healing, documenting and defending patients who cannot defend themselves. Officer Callaway cannot erase those principles from me with a taser." The news segment aired on all channels that night, along with Tasha's documentary footage. Social media spread Ruth's words to millions. And at police stations in the area, officers began to notice the emergence of intimidation tactics. As Ruth and Marcus finally returned home on that spring evening, Ruth's phone vibrated with a call from Agent Cooper. "Miss Avery, I wanted to inform you that tonight we executed search warrants at Officer Callaway's home, his locker at the police station, and his superior's offices. We seized computers, phones, and documents. Because the evidence is so strong, the investigation is moving faster than I expected." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "Thank you, Agent Cooper." "No, Miss Avery, I thank you. In 15 years of investigating civil rights violations, I've rarely seen a victim as brave and clear-sighted as you. You gave us not just evidence but a plan for accountability. This case will change the way healthcare workers are protected nationwide." After hanging up, Ruth leaned back in the truck seat and watched the streetlights pass by. Her head still hurt. Her body still hurt. The bandage on her forehead would leave a mark. However, Officer Callaway's attempt to silence her backfired spectacularly. Instead of a single victim afraid to speak out, there emerged a movement of healthcare workers demanding protection, a community organizing for justice, and a federal investigation that dismantled his conspiracy. The electroshock had knocked him down for a moment. But Ruth Avery had gotten up and brought the whole community with her. 5 months after Ruth Avery was shot with electroshock in a hospital parking lot. The federal courthouse in the regional capital stood majestically against the bright autumn sky. The building's neoclassical architecture, marble columns, wide granite steps, an eagle and scales of justice carved above the entrance, reflected the weight of federal authority. In courtroom 6A, that authority would be tested against a conspiracy that had been years in the making. The case was brought against the United States, Derek Callaway, Margaret Halverson, Raymond Bristo, and Walter Greer. The case involved federal civil rights charges that shocked the legal community when the indictments were announced. A police chief, a district attorney, and a judge were all accused of conspiring to deprive citizens of their civil rights under the law. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity, and additional rooms had been set up to accommodate the hundreds of people who had come to watch justice be served. Ruth sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, surrounded by the 7 other healthcare workers involved in the federal investigation of the case. Marcus sat beside her, radiating protective authority with his Navy SEAL identity. Behind them sat battered and dismissed patients, families who had lost loved ones to violence covered up with false reports, community members who had demanded accountability for years but had been ignored. At the prosecution table sat U.S. Assistant Attorney Victoria Chen, Agent Cooper, and the federal prosecution team. They had spent 5 months preparing what Chen called the most comprehensive civil rights conspiracy case in the history of this region. Callaway, Halverson, Bristo, and Greer sat at the 4 defense tables. Each had expensive teams of lawyers attempting every procedural trick to get the charges dismissed, the evidence suppressed, or the trial moved elsewhere. Federal Judge Sarah Morrison, who had no connection to FBI Assistant Director Morrison but was equally committed to accountability, had denied every request. "All rise," announced the court clerk. The United States District Court, presided over by Judge Sarah Morrison, is now in session. Judge Morrison sat down at the bench, her face expressionless. 64 years old, she was known for her strict management of the court and zero tolerance for abuses. "Be seated. We are here for the hearing of the case between the United States and Callaway et al. Are both parties ready?" "The United States is ready, Your Honor," replied Victoria Chen. Both defense teams confirmed they were ready, but there was no confidence in their voices. The evidence against their clients had been thoroughly documented in pre-trial proceedings, and everyone in the courtroom knew the case was already decided. The only question was how harsh a sentence justice would deliver. Ms. Chen, opening statements. The federal prosecutor stood and began addressing the jury calmly and firmly. The 12 jurors, carefully selected over a 4-day process, were a diverse group of people of different ages, races, and backgrounds. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case concerns a conspiracy to silence anyone who dared to document police violence, and a conspiracy to silence anyone who dared to document police violence. For years, Officer Derek Callaway beat citizens during traffic stops and arrests. When victims reported these assaults, their complaints disappeared. When medical personnel documented injuries proving excessive force, they faced arrest, harassment, and retaliation. Chen projected evidence onto screens in the courtroom, organizational charts showing connections between defendants, timelines documenting patterns of abuse and cover-ups. The evidence will show that this was not an isolated abuse by a single officer. This was a police chief ordering the targeting of healthcare workers, a district attorney refusing to prosecute despite overwhelming evidence, and a judge altering arrest warrants to legally cover up illegal detentions. He clicked on footage of the moment Ruth was attacked, multiple camera angles showing the taser's use, her fall, and the sickening sound of her head hitting the pavement. Several jurors visibly flinched. On March 15 of this year, Officer Callaway used an electroshock weapon on a traumatized nurse. She suffered a traumatic brain injury. What was her crime? Documenting the injuries of a patient who had filed a complaint against Officer Callaway. Chen's voice hardened, but Ms. Avery wasn't the first. The evidence will show 17 documented cases where healthcare workers became targets of retaliation after providing medical evidence of police violence. 7 involve Officer Callaway directly. All were facilitated by Chief Halverson's orders, protected by Prosecutor Bristo's refusal to prosecute, and turning directly to the jury, he stated, "The law is clear. Taking away someone's civil rights under the guise of the law is a federal crime. Conspiring to do so is a federal crime. And when that conspiracy targets witnesses and medical experts to cover up violence, it is not just abuse of power, it is organized criminal activity that attacks the very essence of justice." In their opening statements, the defense attempted to portray each defendant's actions as legitimate. Callaway, an officer making split-second decisions; Halverson, a chief managing a complex department; Bristo, a prosecutor exercising discretion; Greer, a judge relying on information provided by the police. However, these arguments fell flat in the face of the mountain of evidence already documented in the pretrial proceedings. Judge Morrison called the first witness. The United States may call its first witness. The United States calls Ruth Avery. Ruth walked calmly to the witness stand, despite her nervousness. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment with Victoria Chen, but facing the defendants in the courtroom still took courage. The bandage on her forehead was gone, replaced by a thin scar visible on her dark skin, a permanent reminder of what had happened when she documented the truth. Chen began gently, "Miss Avery, please tell the jury about your profession. I am a trauma nurse at County General Hospital. I have been working in the emergency room for 15 years and served as an Army Reserve nurse in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what were you doing at the hospital on March 15th of this year?" Ruth explained that she had treated Jamal Richardson and documented his injuries, which he reported were caused by excessive force during a traffic stop. She outlined the standard medical protocol for assault victims: photographs, detailed descriptions, preservation of evidence. Officer Callaway arrived and demanded I release patient information without proper authorization. When I reminded him of HIPAA regulations and hospital policy, he became aggressive. He arrested me without a search warrant, used excessive force while handcuffing me despite my complete compliance, then restrained me and used a stun gun on me even though I posed no threat. Chen played a video containing unedited footage from 4 different cameras showing the entire incident. The jury watched Ruth, handcuffed and compliant, Callaway claiming she was resisting, the use of the stun gun, Ruth's body convulsing and falling, her head hitting the pavement hard. Several jurors looked disturbed. A woman wiped away tears. "Miss Avery, before treating Mr. Richardson that day, had you encountered Officer Callaway before?" "Not directly. However, in the previous 6 months, I had treated 3 other patients who reported that an officer matching his description and badge number had used excessive force. Each time I documented their injuries according to standard medical protocol. Did you report this to anyone?" "Yes. I submitted 3 separate reports to hospital administration, documenting the injuries and the patient's claims. Each report was supposed to be forwarded to the relevant oversight agencies." "What happened to those reports?" Ruth's jaw tightened. "They disappeared. I never received any confirmation that a follow-up or investigation was conducted." Chen showed Ruth the hospital records showing the dates and submission dates of her reports and emails from Halverson's office to the hospital's legal department instructing them to handle internally all complaints regarding Officer Callaway. The situation was clear. Ruth had tried to report through the proper channels, but those channels had been deliberately blocked by the defendants. "Miss Avery, what were you doing when Officer Callaway administered the stun gun?" "I was standing still. My hands were cuffed behind my back. I was complying with all orders. I was not posing a physical threat to anyone. In your professional medical opinion, was the use of the stun gun justified?" "Absolutely not. Stun guns should be used when a person poses an imminent threat. I was handcuffed, compliant, and surrounded by witnesses, including other officers. There was no justification for the use of force, especially the use of a weapon that caused uncontrolled muscle spasms that prevented me from protecting myself during the fall." Chen showed medical records documenting Ruth's injuries: traumatic brain injury, concussion, 3 staples to close the head wound, weeks of recovery. "How did this attack affect your life and career?" Ruth's voice remained steady. "I still experience headaches and dizziness. I had to take 4 weeks off work, which affected the patients who depend on my care, but the worst impact was on the trust necessary for healthcare. Patients must know their medical records are confidential, that doctors and nurses will document the truth without fear of retaliation. Officer Callaway's assault sends the message that healthcare workers should be afraid to provide evidence against the police." Cross-examination attempted to imply that Ruth was argumentative or provocative, but each question was contradicted by video evidence showing her calm compliance. "You have a history of filing complaints against police officers, don't you?" Callaway's lawyer asked. "I have a history of submitting medical reports documenting the injuries of patients who report assaults. That is my job as a trauma nurse. If these reports constitute complaints against the police, they reflect the police's behavior more than my professional conduct." The next witness was Marcus Avery, who brought with him both the authority of military service and the credibility of a protective older brother who witnessed his sister's assault. "Commander Avery, you were present during your sister's arrest. Please describe what you observed." Marcus's testimony was precise and methodical, as one would expect from someone trained in tactical assessment. "I saw Officer Callaway use a stun gun on a person who was handcuffed, compliant, and posed no threat. In military operations, we are trained to use the minimum necessary force. What I saw violated all principles of proportional response and appropriate use of force." He described Ruth's fall, the blow to her head, and how he immediately recognized she had suffered traumatic brain injury. "I have combat medical training. I knew she needed emergency care. but the officers delayed medical intervention, claiming she was resisting, to solidify their narrative, even though dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras showed she was completely compliant. Victoria Chen called other healthcare workers, and a devastating picture emerged. Each shared similar accounts. They documented injuries caused by police violence, faced retaliation, and had their complaints dismissed despite clear evidence. James Chen recounted being detained in his own emergency room. Nurse Patricia Williams stated that child services were used as a weapon against her. Paramedic David Santos detailed how he lost his career for documenting evidence that contradicted police accounts. Agent Cooper presented the FBI's findings: 17 documented cases of retaliation against healthcare workers, all connected to officers in Callaway's unit or under Chief Halverson's supervision. Financial records showed that DA Bristo received campaign donations in exchange for promising the police union he would not prosecute officers. Email chains revealed that Judge Greer routinely approved arrest warrants without examining possible causes when requested by the police. "This is a conspiracy," Cooper stated plainly. "These are not isolated incidents, but a coordinated effort by multiple officials to strip citizens of their civil rights and silence witnesses who could expose their crimes." Tasha Nguyen testified about her documentary research, presenting footage from numerous cases demonstrating a consistent pattern targeting medical professionals. Her work uncovered connections later confirmed by the FBI, a systematic campaign to intimidate anyone providing evidence of police violence. The prosecution's case was built on 3 weeks of witness testimony. Expert witnesses on the use of force explained how the use of stun guns violated the Constitution, while constitutional law professors explained how the conspiracy violated the protection of civil rights. Medical experts detailed the permanent damage suffered by Ruth and other victims. The defense called character witnesses such as officers praising Callaway's dedication, city officials defending Halverson's leadership, and lawyers attesting to Bristo's honesty. However, each witness collapsed under cross-examination when confronted with the documented pattern of abuse and cover-up. Callaway did not testify himself. His lawyers advised him not to, knowing that the video evidence contradicted his claim of legitimate use of force. Halverson took the witness stand and attempted to shift the blame onto his subordinates, but emails showed he personally ordered targeting troublesome medical personnel. Bristo exercised prosecutorial discretion, but financial records proved he was bought off by the police union. Greer claimed to rely solely on sworn police statements, but documents showed he tampered with the timestamps and signatures on search warrants. The trial ended on a Friday afternoon in late August, as late summer sunlight streamed through the courtroom's large windows. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. When they returned at 10 a.m. on Monday morning, the courtroom was silent except for the rustling of people settling into their seats. Ruth sat between Marcus and Tasha, her hands in her lap, calm despite the magnitude of what was about to happen. The jury foreman, a 56-year-old black woman who had worked as a social worker for 30 years, stood and read the verdict. In the case of the United States versus Derek Callaway, charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights under the guise of law, we find the defendant guilty. Ruth's eyes closed for a moment. Guilty of conspiracy to violate civil rights, guilty of assault under the guise of law, guilty of witness intimidation. He was found guilty on all 18 counts. The president continued reading for each defendant. Margaret Halverson, guilty on all counts: conspiracy, civil rights violation, obstruction of justice. Raymond Bristo, guilty on all counts: conspiracy, abuse of office, accepting bribes to deny prosecution. Walter Greer, guilty on all counts: conspiracy, tampering with official documents, obstruction of justice. The courtroom was filled with tears, embraces, and quiet acknowledgments that justice had finally been served, creating a subdued atmosphere of celebration. Callaway stared straight ahead, looking shocked that his badge had failed to protect him. Halverson looked physically ill. Bristo slumped, defeated. Greer looked 10 years older after the weeks of trial. Judge Morrison banged his gavel to restore order. Sentencing will be held 6 weeks from today. The defendants will remain in federal custody until the verdict is delivered. As the marshals led the handcuffed defendants away, Ruth felt Marcus squeeze her hand. On the other side, Tasha had already begun to draw reactions. Crying families, hugging healthcare workers, the community watching accountability that had seemed impossible months ago. Outside the courthouse, the media surrounded Ruth, Marcus, Victoria Chen, and Agent Cooper. The sun was shining brightly in the late morning, cameras capturing every detail. "Miss Avery, how do you feel about the verdicts?" a reporter asked. Ruth touched the scar on her forehead. "I was proven right. But I also know this victory came because I had resources most victims don't have. A brother who's a Navy SEAL, lawyers who took on my case, federal investigators who believed in me. Too many people silently endure abuse because they think justice isn't possible. What message do you have for other healthcare workers facing retaliation? Document everything. Report it using all available channels. Connect with others who have faced similar retaliation. And know this, the truth has power. Even if systems try to suppress it, the evidence will eventually come to light. Victoria Chen. These convictions send a clear message. There are consequences for civil rights violations. There are consequences for conspiring to silence witnesses. When you violate citizens' constitutional rights, no badge, title, or position will shield you from federal prosecution. Agent Cooper emphasized the systematic nature of the case. This investigation uncovered a conspiracy involving numerous officials in law enforcement and the judicial system. We will continue to investigate similar cases nationwide and urge anyone with information about retaliation against medical professionals to contact the FBI. Tasha's documentary crew recorded everything. The statements, the crowd's reactions, the symbolic image of Ruth standing triumphant on the steps of the courthouse where she had feared months ago that justice would never come. That evening as the sun set over the city, she sat with Ruth Marcus in her living room watching the news. Her face was on every channel, the scar on her forehead now a symbol not of victimhood, but of resistance. Her phone vibrated with a message from Jamal Richardson. "We won, because you had the courage to document the truth, even when it was dangerous. Thank you for not staying silent." Ruth showed this to Marcus. That's what makes this valuable. Not the convictions, though they are important too, but knowing that the victims now have evidence, knowing that their medical records prove their complaints weren't fabricated, knowing that the truth was documented despite attempts to suppress it. Marcus opened social media and saw that justice for Ruth Avery was trending nationwide. Healthcare workers across the country were sharing stories of facing similar reprisals, organizing to demand protection, and using Ruth's case as a model for accountability. "You started a movement," he said quietly. "I just did my job," Ruth replied. "I documented the injuries. I told the truth. I didn't bow to intimidation. This shouldn't be extraordinary. It should be expected of every healthcare worker. But most don't have the courage to fight back when the system resists." Ruth looked at the scar on her face in the mirror across the room, a permanent mark left by the violence used to silence her. Officer Callaway tried to use pain as a weapon of intimidation. He forgot that nurses don't run from pain, they run toward it. We don't abandon patients because treating them is dangerous. And we don't stop telling the truth because doing so leads to retaliation. 6 weeks later, they would return to the same courtroom for sentencing. The defendants would learn exactly how many years they would spend in federal prison for conspiring to violate civil rights and silence witnesses. But tonight, Ruth Avery slept peacefully, knowing that guilty verdicts had been handed down, those responsible had been held accountable, and that healthcare workers across the country now knew that their documentation mattered, their testimony carried weight, and their courage could overcome systems designed to protect the powerful. The taser had knocked her to the ground. The conspiracy had tried to silence her. But Ruth had risen, brought the evidence to light, and proved that justice was possible when healthcare workers refused to sacrifice the truth. 6 weeks after the guilty verdicts, the same federal courtroom filled again for sentencing. The October morning sun streamed through the high windows, illuminating the space where responsibility would finally be measured in prison time. Ruth sat in the front row, surrounded by the healthcare workers who were part of the conspiracy. Behind them, the gallery was filled with community members, victimized patients, and families who had lost loved ones due to years of covered-up violence. At the defense table, Callaway, Halverson, Bristo, and Greer sat in orange prison jumpsuits. Federal custody had stripped them of all remaining claims to authority. Callaway looked diminished, his former arrogance replaced by vacant eyes that accepted his badge no longer protected him. Halverson looked older, the weight of the conspiracy charges evident in new lines on his face. Bristo stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Greer trembled slightly. The former judge was now on trial himself. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom at 10 a.m. with a serious expression. He had spent the last 6 weeks reviewing pre-sentence reports, victim impact statements, and extensive documentation of the damage caused by the conspiracy. "This court has presided over many cases involving abuse of authority," Judge Morrison began. "But very few have involved such a systematic, deliberate, and persistent civil rights violation." He projected statistics onto the courtroom screens, numbers quantifying the years-long conspiracy. Over 8 years, this conspiracy resulted in 17 documented cases of retaliation against healthcare workers, 43 patients whose complaints of assault were dismissed despite medical evidence, and countless other victims who never reported because they believed the system itself was rigged against them. Judge Morrison looked at each defendant. "Your actions did not just harm individuals, you corrupted institutions tasked with protecting citizens. You used law enforcement, prosecutors, and judicial authority as weapons to silence witnesses and cover up violence. You proved that some people's greatest fears about corrupt officials were absolutely justified." He started with Callaway. Derek Callaway, stand up. Callaway slowly stood up, his hands cuffed in front of him. You were the architect and chief implementer of the violence that ignited this conspiracy. For 8 years, you beat citizens during traffic stops and arrests, then targeted the medical personnel who documented your crimes. You used a stun gun on a handcuffed compliant nurse, causing traumatic brain injury that could have been fatal. Judge Morrison's voice hardened. For 17 counts of violating rights under the guise of the law, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison. For conspiracy, 5 consecutive years. For assault under the guise of the law, 3 consecutive years. For witness intimidation, 2 consecutive years. Total sentence, 22 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The number hit like a hammer. Callaway, who was 38, would be 60 when released. His law enforcement career ruined, his most productive years behind him, his reputation permanently tarnished as a convicted civil rights violator. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, you will be stripped of all your retirement benefits. You will be permanently barred from law enforcement, security, or government positions. Upon release, you will serve 5 years of supervised release and perform mandatory community service in healthcare facilities, where you will witness the profession you tried to suppress through violence. Callaway's face showed no emotion, but his hands trembled as the deputies led him back to his seat. Judge Morrison turned to Halverson. Margaret Halverson, rise. The former police chief stood, her expensive lawyers standing beside her. As police chief, you not only failed to stop Officer Callaway's violence, you actively aided it. You ordered the targeting of troublesome medical personnel. You obstructed investigations. You protected officers who violated civil rights because holding them accountable would have exposed systemic problems in your department. For conspiring to violate civil rights, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, 5 years for obstruction of justice, consecutively. 3 years for abuse of office, consecutively. Total sentence, 23 years in federal prison. Halverson, who is 56 years old, will be 79 when released. His career will be over, his legacy destroyed. You will forfeit all retirement benefits accrued during your tenure. You are permanently barred from any law enforcement or government position, and the police department you presided over will operate under a federal consent decree for at least 10 years. Judge Morrison turned to the next defendant, Bristo. Raymond Bristo, as district attorney, you were required to prosecute civil rights violations, but instead you accepted bribes from the police union and refused to prosecute despite ample evidence. You betrayed all the victims seeking justice. 10 years in federal prison for conspiracy, 8 years for accepting bribes, 5 consecutive years for obstruction of justice. Total sentence, 23 years. Finally, he turned to Greer. Walter Greer, you were a sitting judge, someone citizens should trust to uphold the law. Instead, you tampered with arrest warrants, approved illegal detentions, and provided legal cover for a conspiracy that terrorized your community. 12 years for conspiracy, 8 years for falsifying official documents, 5 years for obstruction of justice. Total sentence, 25 years in federal prison. At 68 years old, Greer would likely die in prison. Judge Morrison addressed the courtroom. To the victims, these sentences cannot compensate for the harm you suffered. They cannot restore destroyed careers, violated trust, or the damage done. But I hope they provide some closure and send a clear message that conspiracies violating civil rights will be prosecuted with the full force of federal law. He looked directly at Ruth. Ms. Avery, your courage to stand up in a situation where most would remain silent, your brother's support, the other healthcare workers who came forward, and the FBI's extensive investigation, together, you exposed a conspiracy that had been going on for years, based on the victims' belief that justice was impossible. You proved that belief wrong. As the marshals led the convicted conspirators out of the courtroom for the last time, the courtroom filled with tears and embraces. Ruth felt Marcus's arm around her shoulders, Tasha's hand squeezing hers, the collective relief of a community seeing justice served. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed around key figures. It was a bright October morning, perfect for new beginnings under the autumn sun. Miss Avery, these are the longest sentences ever handed down for a civil rights conspiracy in this region, said a reporter. What does this mean for police accountability nationwide? Ruth touched the scar on her forehead, faded but still visible, a permanent reminder of what had triggered this transformation. It means these are the consequences of the conspiracy. It means healthcare workers who document the truth are protected by federal law. It means victims of police violence have credible evidence. And it means that when citizens refuse to remain silent, no badge, no position, no conspiracy is above accountability. Agent Cooper emphasized the broader implications. This case has led to investigations in 17 other jurisdictions where we've identified similar patterns targeting medical professionals. Federal protections for healthcare workers documenting injuries are being strengthened. This is just the beginning of systemic reform. Victoria Chen explained the civil settlements. The city agreed to pay a $45 million settlement to be distributed to victims. The $45 million settlement will be distributed among victims including healthcare workers subjected to retaliation, patients whose complaints were dismissed, and families who lost loved ones in covered-up incidents of violence. Additionally, the police department will be completely restructured under federal oversight. 3 months later, on a cool January morning with the bright winter sun illuminating the fresh snow, the opening ceremony for the Ruth Avery Community Care Center was held. The building stood on the site of a dilapidated structure that had once symbolized urban neglect. Now it was a modern 2-story healthcare facility with warm brick facades, large windows filling the interior with natural light, and a soaring hummingbird mural encircling the corner entrance. Ruth stood on the front steps in her winter coat, the midday sun making the snow sparkle like diamonds. The gathered crowd represented the heart of the community: elderly church members, veterans, nurses from County General, patients she had treated over the years, families involved in the conspiracy investigation. Tasha made her way through the crowd with her camera crew, capturing this moment for the final episode of her documentary. Command Under Fire: How a Nurse's Courage Exposed a Police Conspiracy had won awards and led to nationwide policy changes. Today's filming would show that healing had replaced the damage. The newly elected mayor, civil rights attorney Patricia Ramirez, who ran on a platform of police reform, approached the podium. The winter sun illuminated the brass dedication plaque beside the entrance. We are gathered today not just to open a building, but to celebrate transformation. This facility exists because Ruth Avery refused to remain silent when she documented the violence. It exists because this city's healthcare workers came together to demand protection. It exists because a community organized to ensure justice is not just a word, but a reality. She listed the reforms implemented in recent months: a complete overhaul of the police department under federal oversight, a civilian review board with subpoena power and full access to all records, mandatory body cameras with tamper-proof technology that upload directly to independent servers, a ban on retaliation against medical professionals who document injuries, a duty to intervene for officers who witness misconduct, community policing initiatives that require officers to work in the neighborhoods they serve. These changes happened because people refused to accept that abuse was normal. Mayor Ramirez continued. Ruth Avery, other healthcare workers facing retaliation, patients who continued to report despite being fired, community members demanding accountability. When citizens come together, you prove that reform is possible. Deacon Brown prayed in a clear voice under the crisp winter sky. May this place heal bodies and souls. When good people refuse to bow to evil, let this be proof that justice, though delayed, cannot be denied. Ruth was invited to cut the ribbon. Marcus stood beside her, protective even though the danger had passed. The winter sun made the red ribbon sparkle. Would you like to say something? Asked Mayor Ramirez. Ruth stepped toward the microphone and looked out at hundreds of faces: colleagues, patients, community members, people whose lives had intersected with her fight for justice. 8 months ago, I was attacked for doing my job. I was attacked for documenting the injuries of a patient who reported police violence. Officer Callaway wanted to send a message to healthcare workers that they should be afraid to speak the truth by electrocuting me. But he forgot one important thing about nurses, doctors, and paramedics. We don't abandon patients because treating them is dangerous. We don't stop documenting evidence because we'll face retaliation. We don't run from pain. We run toward it. He pointed to the building behind him. This center exists because of everyone who refused to stay silent. Healthcare workers who told their stories. Patients who continued to report despite being dismissed. Investigative journalists, FBI agents who believed in us, a community that organized and demanded change. Together we proved that conspiracies can be exposed, that power is accountable, and that healing can replace harm. Ruth and Marcus, as siblings in transformation, joined together to cut the ribbon. When the ribbon was cut, applause thundered over the crowd. Inside, it was filled with a purposeful buzz. The first floor housed examination rooms, a pharmacy providing medications at cost, mental health counseling offices, and a community meeting space. The second floor featured classrooms where Marcus held civil courage seminars, practical training in organizing, documenting abuse, and holding people accountable without resorting to violence. Neighborhood children had drawn small hummingbirds, scaled to their height on the tiles lining the corridors. Each carried a hopeful message: truth heals. Our doors are open. Everyone belongs here. Ruth led afternoon tours, showing visitors the free clinic areas where volunteer medical professionals provided care regardless of ability to pay. Dr. James Chen worked at an examination station. The emergency physician, arrested for documenting police violence, now served the community that supported him. Nurse Patricia Williams worked in the pediatrics department. After it emerged that the Child Services investigation, she proudly displayed photos of her children. In the mental health department, counselors trained in trauma therapy provided care to healthcare workers suffering from PTSD due to retaliation from police violence, healthcare workers suffering from PTSD due to retaliation, and anyone else in need of support. Services were completely free and funded by civil settlement money and community donations. Marcus's was filled with veterans learning to organize effectively, community elders, and young activists. On the whiteboard were Ruth's guiding principles. Document everything. Report through all channels. Connect with others. Refuse to be silent. By late afternoon, as the winter sun filtered through the west-facing windows, the center had achieved its purpose. Patients were cared for. Community members participated in organizing workshops. Children explored the art-filled hallways with curiosity. Ruth found Marcus in his classroom, reviewing lesson plans for next week's seminar on the use of medical evidence in civil rights cases. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Right. It's as if we've turned violence into something that serves the community." He pointed to the windows overlooking the neighborhood. "Callaway thought he could protect his conspiracy by eliminating you. Instead, he exposed everything and created this." As the staff prepared to close for the evening, they wandered through the building together. Through the large windows, a hummingbird mural was visible. Its wings spread in endless flight, catching the last rays of the winter sun. Outside, a small group remained in the parking lot, patients who had been treated throughout the day, grateful for care they couldn't receive elsewhere. A woman approached Ruth, tears streaming down her face. 3 years ago, I reported being attacked during a traffic stop. I had my injuries, my witnesses, everything. But my complaint was dismissed. They said I was lying, that I had inflicted my injuries on myself. I gave up believing anyone would care." The woman pointed to the center. "But you didn't give up. When they hurt you, you fought back. And because you fought, people like me could finally prove we weren't crazy, we weren't lying, that the system really was against us. Thank you for not staying silent." Ruth hugged the woman gently. "We all stayed silent for too long, but together we found our voice. That's what made the difference." As evening approached and the winter sun painted the sky with amber tones, Ruth and Marcus locked the center's doors. Tomorrow it would open again, serving hundreds of patients each week, teaching dozens of activists about community organizing, providing mental health support to victims of violence. But tonight, standing outside, watching the hummingbird mural catch the last light, the bird's wings glowed gold, a symbol of resilience and healing. "Callaway is serving the first year of his 22-year sentence," Marcus said. "Halverson, Bristo, and Greer have all begun serving their sentences. The conspiracy has collapsed, the department is being restructured, and you built something that heals instead of harms." Ruth looked at the center. Warm light streamed from the windows, and every architectural detail seemed designed to welcome rather than intimidate, a promise of care. "I didn't build this alone." Healthcare workers had to refuse to be intimidated. Patients had to keep reporting, even when they were rejected. A community had to organize for change. Federal investigators had to believe the victims. We all had to stand together. Her phone rang. A message from the nurses' union. Healthcare worker protection had been signed into federal law, and retaliation against medical professionals who documented injuries from police violence was now a specific crime. The law was called Ruth's Law. "They named it after you," Marcus said, reading over her shoulder. "They should have named it after all of us. Every healthcare worker who faced retaliation, every patient who continues to report, every person who refuses to accept that this abuse is normal." There was quiet determination in Ruth's voice. "This law exists because we proved that documentation matters, that medical evidence creates accountability, and that when enough people demand justice, the conspiracy can be defeated." On their way home that winter evening, they passed the streets where community members now walked fearlessly, the hospital where Ruth would return to work next week, the same emergency room where she was arrested, now operating under strict federal protections for medical staff, and the courthouse where justice had been served. Ruth felt the weight of the past 8 months transform into a kind of peace. The scar on her forehead would always remain, visible proof of the violence used to silence her. But that scar had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol reminding us that healthcare workers documenting the truth are protected by federal law and proving that when victims refuse to remain silent, the conspiracy can be exposed. Officer Derek Callaway had tried to use pain as a weapon of intimidation, but Ruth Avery had turned that pain into purpose, violence into healing, and conspiracy into accountability. The taser had knocked her down for a moment, but she got back up and brought an entire movement with her. Healthcare workers protected by new federal laws, patients whose medical evidence would be taken seriously, a community that knew justice was possible when people refused to submit to abuse. In federal prison, Callaway would spend decades reflecting on his catastrophic mistake, realizing he had exposed a conspiracy by targeting a nurse, documenting the truth, ruined many careers, and spurred nationwide protections for healthcare workers. But at the Ruth Avery Community Care Center, healing would continue every day. Patients were receiving care, activists were learning to organize, victims were finding support, and the community was proving that hope could replace harm when people chose courage over silence. The hummingbird spread its wings wide in its endless flight. The truth had been documented, justice had been served, and healing had begun.